Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And I say here, I'm also in Hartford, just down the block from the Twain House. But for the past 18 months or so, we have considered this virtual crowdcast platform part of the Mark Twain House itself. So when we have speakers like we have tonight coming to join us, it's the same as happening with the Mark Twain House. And we've been so delighted to welcome people from all over the country, all over the world to these programs. I think you're going to really enjoy tonight's conversation. I've spent a little bit of time with our guests in the green room and in a tech run beforehand, and I think you're going to really be glad you're here tonight. I have to apologize. There's a little bit of an echo that we have not been able to resolve. And it seems to only happen when I'm talking. So I will talk very quickly and get out of the way. And then you won't have to be troubled with that anymore. So I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, you've all discovered the chat. Please continue to chat away freely in that section. It's really fun, and we find that we've really built a big community, a virtual community among people who have participated in our programs and got to know one another in the chat. However, toward the end of our program, last 20 minutes or so, we are going to do an audience Q&A. If you have a question for either Christine or Gordon, if you would please take a moment to post that down in the Ask a Question area at the bottom of the screen. That will ensure that I see it and that it will get included in the Q&A section. Very hard to keep track of the questions when they're just in the chat, so please indulge us with that. Also in the chat, you'll see a link for purchasing this book. Gordon, will you hold it up for us, please? Waiting for an echo. Christine Montross's wonderful book that we're going to be talking about tonight. Now, we know that you can purchase this elsewhere, obviously, but if you do purchase it through us, first of all, Christine has been gracious enough to sign book plates for us, so you get a signed copy. And also know that your purchase benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum, and that should make you feel good about buying it through us. And that's the other thing I want to talk about is that long green button right beneath our faces. It says your donation here will be shared equally by the Mark Twain House and Museum and community partners in action. It's been a rough couple of months for nonprofits all across the nation, across the world, including ours. And anything that you can do, and we know that it's not been an easy time for people in the audience as well, but anything you can spare in the way of a donation, large or small. I think I can speak safely on behalf of both organizations when I say that every penny is deeply appreciated and every penny is put to really good use. So, if you're able to help us out, we appreciate it a lot. So thank you for that. So I want to talk just for a moment before I introduce our guests formally about the relationship between Mark Twain and Community Partners in Action over the years. So Community Partners in Action was founded in 1875, so that was during the time that Mark Twain lived in Hartford, as the Prisoners' Friends Society, with Mark Twain as one of their founding benefactors. Community Partners in Action focuses on behavioral change and advocates for criminal justice reform. CPA's employment, basic needs, reentry, and recovery services work together to reduce recidivism, enhance public safety, and inform policy, all at a fraction of the cost of prison. In partnership with the state of Connecticut, the U.S. government, private funders, organizations, and businesses, Community Partners in Action works to make a positive impact in the lives of adults and youth throughout Connecticut, and what a service they perform. We've collaborated before with CPA. The Twain House and the Stowe Center included a presentation with Piper Kernan, author of Orange is the New Black, some years ago. And so this is a continuation of that relationship, and we're really proud and delighted to do it. So Gordon Lyde is our moderator tonight. He's a peer-to-peer case manager for CPA in their reentry treatment program, and we're delighted to have him here tonight. And he's going to be speaking with the author of tonight's book, Brown University professor and practicing psychiatrist, Dr. Christine Montross. She spent her career treating the most severely ill psychiatric patients, and several years ago, she set out to investigate why so many of her patients got caught up in the legal system when discharged from her care and what happened to them therein. So we're going to hear a lot about that tonight. I'm going to come back for Q&A at the end, but I'm going to sit back and enjoy the conversation. Welcome, Gordon. Welcome, Christine. Thank you for being here with us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Christine, where do I begin? This book, it was so informative. I'm at a loss of words where to begin with that book. It touched on a lot of different things. So, jumping right in, walk us through the process when you realized there was such a need for a book like this.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. I'm really excited to be here. I knew of the Mark Twain House, but then was listening to the Ocean Vuong audiobook of On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, which I recommend to everyone also as you're buying books tonight. And he was mentioning how one of his first readings was at the Mark Twain House. And so I had this moment of kind of cosmic connection about feeling fortunate to be here. So I'm really delighted to be here, really happy to be talking with you, Gordon. And I think, you and I have talked a little bit about how the need for this book is really apparent to those of us who work in the system or are aware of the system. But as as was mentioned in the introduction, I work in an inpatient psychiatric hospital, and I work on the intensive treatment units there, which are the equivalent of the ICU, except for psychiatry. So the patients that I treat are severely mentally ill. They are hearing voices or seeing visions. They're very manic, or they're actively trying to hurt themselves or other people. They really need a high level of care. And I love my job, but I see a great deal of suffering in it. And one of the things that I see quite frequently is that my patients come in contact with police, and many of them serve time in jails and prisons. And so I couldn't help but think about, when I was talking to my patients about these encounters, wondering what it must be like for them when they're in these environments that are punitive rather than therapeutic. And also really an understanding of the history of mental health treatment and mental health care in our country, where we closed state hospitals in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and have continued to cut funding ever since. And you see that the very people who were discharged from the state hospitals then shift into another kind of institution, into the prison system. So I really was curious about what happened to my patients when they were there. So I started doing competency to stand trial evaluations in the jails and prisons. And the thing that struck me the most, Gordon, was how if you took the people that I was seeing in my hospital and in the jails and took them out of those environments and put them in a room, they were really indistinguishable to me. I would not have been able to know which mentally ill people were in a prison and which were in my hospital. That struck me as unfair. It did not feel right to me that people who were mentally ill enough to require hospital treatment were in these punitive environments. And then what I found, the longer that I looked and the more that I researched prisons and jails, the more I spent time in our correctional facilities, was I realized that these are places that do not promote psychological wellness for anyone. So mentally ill people get worse, and mentally well people, when they go into prisons and jails, often emerge psychologically damaged.
Wow. I mean, that's right on point. And your book explains a lot about that. And it's funny when you was talking about the similarities. If you put one of your patients and someone from the institution that you were doing a competency evaluation for, if you put them side by side, you even had an example of that in your book with where there's a Henry and Robert. They had almost identical charges. They had run-ins with the law, and they had the same type of reactions within the facilities.
Yeah.
What I found interesting is the environment that they found themselves, there was a different outcome.
Yeah.
They responded to authority with the same delusions and paranoia, but the outcome was totally different. Even the rationale of the staff members by their actions.
Yeah. That was a stark example, and unfortunately not an uncommon example. But these were two men that I saw. One I saw in my hospital, and one I saw doing a competency evaluation in jail. Both of them had had situations where police had been called because they were behaving in erratic ways.
Mhm.
So the man that I call Henry was hiding behind a dumpster in a convenience store that he had been asked to leave. The convenience store clerk called the police because he wouldn't come out from behind the dumpster. The police arrived. He still wouldn't come out from behind the dumpster. And so eventually they pulled him out from behind and took him to jail. The charge that he faced, which was criminal trespass, was a misdemeanor charge. It did not come with a substantial penalty, although the maximum sentence could have involved some jail time. But he went to jail, and while he was there, he was quite paranoid. He would not take any medication while he was there, and he was really afraid to come out of his cell. When he was asked to do so by the correctional officers, he refused, and they did what's called a cell extraction, which is a sort of euphemism for going in and pulling someone out of their cell when they don't comply. In that moment, he became assaultive and started to strike the correctional officers who were coming in after him. Striking a correctional officer is a felony assault. And so at the end of that altercation, he faced charges that could land him potentially in jail for 15 years of his life. And I contrast that in the book with a patient I saw who I call Robert, who came into my hospital after, similar kind of community disturbance. He was shouting things in his neighborhood, shouting paranoid ideas about being part of an espionage plan. And he was brought in, and police were called. And instead of taking him to jail, they brought him to the hospital. That's often an arbitrary decision that's made in the moment of the police encounter by people who are not psychologically or psychiatrically trained. But they brought Robert to the hospital. He also refused to take medication while he was there. He remained paranoid while he was there. And he had a delusion that the hospital was not, in fact, a hospital, but was a holding facility, and that he was awaiting execution. He misinterpreted something that happened on the unit. Some staff members were closing blinds, and he interpreted that as a sign that executions were about to begin. He charged out of the kitchen and began attacking staff, yelling, "Tonight is the night they're going to kill us all." He actually severely injured some of the staff members at my hospital. Two young women obtained concussions. A man required knee surgery from trying to subdue him. None of the staff workers pressed charges. They all said they understood that he feared for his life and he was acting out of fear. 15 days after this episode, Robert had been medicated. A treatment plan had been established for him as an outpatient. He was discharged from the hospital with plans for intensive outpatient care. So this juxtaposition for me of one man who 15 days after was released back home, and one man who faced 15 years in prison as a result of very similar actions, really underscored to me the grave problem of what happens when our mentally ill citizens come in contact with police and the legal system.
Wow. So I'm sitting back thinking there has to be, that was just one example. I'm almost positive that things like that happen all over the place, that individuals, because of mental illness, they, because of what I like to call, it's like your example, the wording you use, the trans-institutionalization, where even during that time where they transitioned from asylums and giving that civil rights back to patients' mental health, they empowered them with the right to refuse medications,
Mhm, mhm.
which I find interesting is you give them the right to refuse medication, which to make that decision relies on the part of the brain that's mostly affected by their mental illness. It's like a catch 22. And then they catch these petty charges, and then they're put into a punitive situation that doesn't look at mental health. They just look at behavioral, and 3 month sentence can turn into years. I find that very disturbing.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's something that people I think lack an awareness of. And when you ask about why did this book need to be written, I think that people don't fully understand the ways that charges can multiply when people aren't compliant. And one of the things that I really spent quite a lot of time thinking about was how in training to become a psychiatrist, we learn very specific ways to interact with people who are paranoid or who are agitated or who have the capacity to become dangerous. Almost none of those ways that we learn overlap with the methodology of police. And I think that's not necessarily the fault of police officers, but I think when we're at this moment in our country where we're really at a reckoning around policing, one of the questions that has emerged for me, it is about that moment of the police encounter. That what I learn as a psychiatrist is if someone is paranoid or aggressive or agitated, you come in quietly. You speak to them in a tone that is not threatening. You give them options. Hey, you can go to your room. You can go to your sensory room. You can sit down over here. We can stay right here and talk. I can back up a little bit. You give them options. You don't compel them to do anything. You don't encircle them and encroach them, so you don't crowd around them and corner them. And you really want to collaborate and become an ally with the person so that they can diffuse the situation a little bit. This is really antithetical to how police and correctional officers operate, right? As evidenced by the cell extraction. They expect obedience, and the environment of the prison expects obedience. When you're hearing voices or seeing visions, when you're profoundly depressed and therefore unable to, get up off of the couch or eat or speak, you can't comply in the way that's expected of you in these environments. So I think that fundamental misalignment is a really critical one, and it has tragic consequences. People with severe mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed by police than people who are mentally well. And then, you and I touched on this a little bit also, but the other thing that can happen is that people can be sent to solitary confinement if they misbehave within the correctional facility.
Mm.
And so sentences that begin as short sentences can become these really lengthy, really draconian sentences by punishments that are adjudicated entirely within the prison and jail system. No one's sentenced by a judge to solitary confinement. These are punishments that are handed down by the facility, and we see mentally ill people consistently accumulating weeks, months, years of time in solitary because they're unable to comply with the expectations of behavior.
Hmm. And how much damage would you say that sensory, sort of quasi sensory deprivation, the no human contact, how much damage would you say that does to a person with mental illness, or a person that enters that without mental illness, the potential for that developing? Is that a possibility?
Sure. I think we're at a moment of unique empathy in terms of that question. I think the pandemic, coincidentally, has offered us all a glimpse into what it means to be isolated, right? So we understand that there's been a huge rise in depressive and anxious symptoms in people, and particularly during the lockdowns. And I would imagine many of the people in the audience here tonight experienced that. When we are
Mm.
separated from our routines, our loved ones, our free choices, when we are not able to go to the bed of a loved one who is sick or dying, when we're not able to see our children or our grandchildren, when we're not able to care for an ill parent or go into a nursing home where our grandparent lives, that feels inhuman to us. And I think that's critical for us to understand. We do this intentionally to people when we send them into prolonged incarcerations. We do it to children. When we send juveniles away, there's been quite a lot of concern, correctly, about how adolescents are handling this period of the pandemic. We're very up in arms, appropriately so, about the fact that kids haven't had the structure of school. They haven't had their sports teams. They haven't had their choirs and their musical theater. They haven't had connections with peers and trusted adults. But we do that intentionally when we send kids to juvenile detention facilities. And so I think it's a moment where we really have a rare window into what that experience is like. And it forces us to sort of look in the mirror and reflect upon what we're doing when we send people to these environments.
Wow, that's a perfect segue into what I was thinking previously about, because you also talked about in the chapter titled jail, not Yale, about Manson Youth Institute, what they call MYI, right on the Cheshire compound where the
Mhm.
adult prison is.
Yeah,
And they seem to be okay with locking away these children, some for some heinous crimes, but they put them in segregation, and some could be there. A 15-year-old could be in solitary for the better part of a year.
that's right. Yep. When I was visiting there, I asked how long a child could be kept in segregation. This is a facility that houses 14 to 20-year-old boys. And I use the word boys intentionally because, they are teenagers, or we know in psychiatry that the brain does not develop until 25, 26 into an adult brain, particularly in young men. So you're really dealing with adolescent brains here. So you have children, teenagers who are incarcerated ages 14 to 20. And yeah, when I was visiting there, I asked, what's the most severe punishment that a child here can be given? And they said he can be sent to segregation, which is the euphemistic term for solitary confinement. I said, for how long? And they said up to a year. And that was, as a neuroscientist, that was really appalling to me. As a parent, that was also really appalling to me. But I think, to think about the neurologic development that occurs between the ages of 14 to 20. And then back to your earlier question, Gordon, what happens when there's sensory deprivation during that period of development? So not only are these kids not on their sports teams and not in school, and not with their families, they're also completely cut off from any kind of communication. Their meals are shoved at them through a slot. They might have 1 hour of recreation time a day. And so, what we know about the developing brain is that it requires stimulation to develop appropriately. So, we know that when juveniles are in solitary confinement, their brains are physically altered. So, on the cellular level, on the molecular level, their brains are changed. And that's partially because experience of the world builds our brain circuitry. It changes the way that our circuits are wired. And our developing brain waits for these experiences so that it can form, and so that it can mature. When kids are deprived of those experiences, we are depriving their brains of that necessary stimulation. So I think, this really gets to the question. I kept thinking about the word corrections when I was writing this book, and the intention of our justice system to make people better, to improve them. And then the fact that we employ these practices that so clearly do the opposite, that you don't want a young man released into the community after he's had a year of sensory deprivation and his brain has failed to develop and mature in the way it ought to.
Yeah. And I was also looking at with the Department of Corrections. They seem to have this classification scale for mental health. And I guess it's across the board from 1 to 5. And you put the definition of the a level 5 mental health score that these individuals are severely impaired with an acute psychiatric condition such as major psychosis, affective disorder, major depression, and or acute anxiety. These offenders represent a potential danger to themselves and or others and are gravely disabled. And that stood out to me because, as it was mentioned, I am a peer-to-peer case manager, and the population in which I work with are individuals coming out of the prison system.
Mhm.
And they will, I have noticed that we will receive not a level 5, but a level 4. The level would be dropped down a day before they're getting out, and they will be let out into the society. And I find it interesting if that's their definition, that they're gravely disabled, but they allow them back out into society with no supervision.
Mhm.
I find that also disturbing. And then my biggest question was that, are these classifications accurate,
Mhm.
or are they just a label that they place? Are they more severe than what they say? It's kind of hard based on their track record to trust the classifications in which they place on individuals.
So my experience has been sometimes yes and sometimes no. And interestingly, when I see classifications that are wrong, it's often detainees who are so profoundly ill, but are able to sort of fly under the radar. So they might be scored a 3, when really, once I talk to them for an hour, it's very clear that they're 5. So I also think in an environment that's not geared toward diagnosis and treatment, the point of the time there is not for someone to really be understood and assessed and analyzed and treated. The point is for someone to be quickly classified and managed, right? Those are very different aims. So I do see people who are appropriately scored, and I see people who are less appropriately scored. I think one of the interesting questions for us as a society is, do we think someone who scores a 5 ought to be in a place like prison in the first place? And one of the lessons that I learned pretty quickly in looking at alternate systems abroad, because one of the things that gave me hope in this research project was to look and see that there are places in the world that do this differently and do this humanely and also have better outcomes than we do. So that was really hopeful to see. But one of the places that I visited was Sweden. And one of the first questions that I asked, because it was really at the crux of my book, was, how do you handle severely mentally ill people who are in prison? And they said, well, we don't incarcerate severely mentally ill people. And first of all, I had this kind of selfish reaction of like my whole book project crumbling. but then I was so interested in this idea, and I said, well, what do you mean? Like, if someone who's schizophrenic commits a crime, what happens? And she said, well, we send them to a hospital. We don't send them to jail. We don't have any people with schizophrenia in our prisons. And I was floored by that idea. And it seemed to me such a fundamental difference. So I think, one of the lessons that this book taught me was to sort of back up and ask big philosophical questions. Do we believe as a society that people who are gravely disabled belong in an environment that demands compliance and obedience and is punitive? We might come down differently on that, but I would say no. And if those people are truly a danger to themselves or to others, my hospital treats people all the time who are dangerous to themselves or others. That's what we do. People were admitted to the hospital for those reasons. So the idea that people can't be kept safe in an institution, I think is untrue. So yeah, level 5 versus level 3.
Yeah. And you mentioned we have to think that philosophical question. It brings to mind a college assignment we had some time ago. It was called the miracle question.
Mhm.
So to you, what would be your philosophical question overall if you was able to address the prison system what question would you present to them to sort of move them in a direction away from punitive to more correction, more help?
Yeah. What a great college question. I love that. The miracle question. To me, there is a philosophical question at the root of this. And it's really about what our intentions are as a society. We say that we want safety and justice. That's why we incarcerate people. We want to enact justice and we want safer communities. And yet, year after year after year, statistics come out and demonstrate that our current practices do not do that well. We have high recidivism rates. We have stable levels of crime in our communities that are unrelated to our levels of incarceration. We are, and oftentimes the system doesn't feel just to people, particularly not people of color, particularly people without resources. So we're not doing a good job at safety and justice. What we do really well is suffering and vengeance. We are really, really good at that. We have designed a prison system where we maximize suffering. We take away programming. We take away creature comforts. We take away human connection and connection with community and family. And we really have taken seriously the idea that if people have committed a crime, then they deserve whatever kind of treatment they get when they're incarcerated. And we don't have to worry about it too much. So my big question would be, which one do we want? I think as a moral society, what we purport to desire, safety and justice, is the correct answer. If we really want vengeance and suffering, then we should just say that and be honest about it. But if we don't, then we have to change our methodology. And what I found when I went to places like Scandinavia, I visited Halden Prison in Norway, and Norway had a prison system that had many of the same problems of ours in the 1990s. They had a great deal of violence in their prisons. They had prison riots and escapes. They had detainees who were murdered by each other. They had correctional officers that were murdered. And the government took a step back and asked a big question of experts and said, how do we fix this? The experts came back and said, we have to stop meeting hard with hard and start meeting hard with soft. And what they meant by that was these harsh, draconian, punitive practices were not yielding the results that they wanted. They said, we want better neighbors. We want people to leave the prison and become contributing members of society. We want them to pay taxes. We want them to get jobs. So how do we do that? Well, what they decided was you do a needs assessment when someone comes into the prison. You figure out why they were in a situation where they committed the offense that they committed. And then the work of the sentence, instead of just doing time like we do in America, really is about addressing the factors that played into that situation. So if you need education, you get education while you're incarcerated. If you need job training, you get job training. If you need anger management or substance abuse treatment or marital counseling or parenting classes, that's the work of the period of the sentence. And I think in America, where 95% of our detainees are released back into our communities, we should want that too. We should want people to become better people, stronger, healthier, more psychologically well people during the period of time that they're incarcerated. But in fact, we do the opposite. You know, they did one thing that I think was critical in implementing the soft, meeting hard with soft. They transformed the role of the correctional officer. So instead of being a pure authority figure, the correctional officers were trained in security, but they also received extensive training in something that I would call like social work. So just like when you go into a hospital, you have a nurse who's really assigned to your case and follows your care. Their correctional officer, their security officer, is paired with them. Make sure that they go to class. Make sure that they go to their job training. It is really talking to them about, what do you want to do when you leave here? How can we get you there? How can we promote that healing that has to happen while you're here? And then in a way that blew my mind compared to American prisons, the security officers, the correctional officers, and the detainees mingle together in interactions throughout the day, all day, every day. They sit down to meals together. They play soccer during rec time together, all mixed up on the teams. They prepare meals together. And I think that idea that it's not this hierarchical, adversarial relationship, but it's a partnership, a collaboration meant to move the person forward into a place of where they can contribute when they leave, is radical and wonderful and would get us to safety and justice much more than our current practices do.
Oh, I really like that. That's more solution focused. It's like, okay, yeah, you were here, you did this. Okay, we acknowledge that that happened. Let's move on. What do you want to do about it? Because I'm also a firm believer, if you take an individual with the same mentality and return to the same environment, he or she will do the same thing that they did the last time. It will just the cycle will continue to just roll. Nothing will be broken, nothing will be changed.
And all of us do that, right? Like, you put me in front of a plate of chocolate chip cookies, I'm going there every single time.
Yeah.
So that's a human thing. That's not a flaw of someone who's incarcerated. That's a
Hmm.
human thing.
Yeah. So I think I love that question. I love that view, and I love how that can change things because something has to change when we think about it because the statistics show that I think it's somewhere around 80 to 85% reoffend and come back. It's the recidivism is just increasing
Yeah.
yearly. Every year it just gets greater, and I find that very disturbing at the same time because
Yeah.
even when I looked at when you talked about Manson youth, one of the things you pointed out and you briefly touched on it was that when you walked in there, all you seen, the only white faces you seen were the adults.
Right.
So you have this marginalized population in there that's housed these children, and the only authority there's no visual identification. Do you think that plays a part in their psychological development in association with as when they society as a large upon release and moving towards release?
Well, of course. Yes. And our psyches too, right? When the only kids that we see locked up are black and brown kids, that also changes how we think about people, right? So,
Mhm.
so yes, of course it does. And to link back to something earlier that we were talking about too, in terms of this idea that prison, if you're in prison, you deserve whatever comes because you're a bad person. We have to acknowledge that there are people serving time in jails and prisons for things that those of us who live free lives have done without consequence. So there are innocent people in jail and prison who are in that environment and dealing with the environment despite the fact that they're innocent. And there are people who are there because there are marginalized groups that are incarcerated at greater rates than majority groups are. And getting back to juveniles for a moment, one of the places where I think this is most profound, not because it's different than how adults are treated, but because I think we can more easily see the insidiousness of starting at an early age. There's substantial racial bias in juvenile sentencing. So Black kids are more than twice as likely to be arrested in the first place than white kids are for the same exact offense. They're less likely to have cases diverted. So white kids are more likely to be sent for treatment or to be sent to community service, and Black kids are more likely to have their cases stay within the legal system. White kids are more likely to be sentenced to probation for the same crime that Black kids are sentenced to jail time. And Black kids are more than 4 times as likely to be committed to a detention facility than white kids are. And I think that that this demands a really close examination of the systemic racism that drives our carceral system. Of course, the authoritative, beautiful, magnificent work on this is Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which I think should be required reading for anyone interested in this subject. But there was a beautiful, elegant, really disturbing study that came out of Stanford that looked at racial bias in sentencing. It took 700 white subjects. It took white subjects because we are overrepresented in the judiciary and in jury pools, and it divided those 700 white subjects into 2 groups. And at the time, there was a real Supreme Court case before the court weighing life sentences without the possibility of parole for juveniles, which was actually legal until recently. So the question was, could a juvenile who committed a crime be sentenced to life in prison without ever having the possibility of parole? They were presented with this real case of a 14-year-old boy with 17 prior convictions who had been convicted of a brutal assault on an elderly woman. They changed one word between the 2 groups. One group, they described him as a black child. The other group they described as a white child. They altered just that one word. What they found was that subjects in the trial who were reading about a Black juvenile expressed significantly more support for life in prison without the possibility of parole for juveniles than those who read about a white juvenile. And they also found that subjects who read about a Black juvenile were more apt to say that kids should be tried as adults. They were more apt to say that juveniles should be considered the same as adults. They should be tried as adults and held in adult prisons, whereas those reading about a white child were more apt to say they did not think juveniles should be tried as adults. So we have to recognize, this is why it makes me a little bit irritated when people talk about like the one bad prosecutor or the one bad sheriff who is sentencing kids with discrimination. And what I really want to get across is that this is in all of us. It's in our country. It's baked into our legal system. And so we have to be honest and frank about that so that we can try to dismantle it.
I totally agree. Change cannot happen unless we take an honest look at things and be honest about our own personal bias,
Right.
the way we view things, and everything. Only then can we put it in front of us and see it for what it really is and say, okay, now I see it. Now some things need to change.
Yeah.
I say we can go on with this for like ever.
I'm in.
I still have like a list of questions, but we need to save time for the Q&A. So Jen, could you come back in and help us with the Q&A, please?
Somewhat reluctantly, I am coming on screen because I could listen to this. I just, my head is spinning. So thank you both so much.
Thank you.
We do have a few audience questions, and I encourage people to throw in some more questions, but I have one of my own. I don't know that we talked so much about the economics of this. We talked about, Scandinavia and other countries who handle these situations quite differently. And obviously, or maybe not, that requires an investment up front, but then probably yields something on the other end. Can you talk about that whole equation?
Yeah, definitely. And that was one of the central things that I was curious about when I saw these differences, because I imagined right away, wait a second, could we really do something like this? What I looked at to start was to say, because people would say, well, Norway, Scandinavia has these really crazy tax rates and they're so much more substantial than ours. The discrepancy is really not as large as you might imagine. So, for example, I'm cheating and looking at, I had a little note here. But the annual costs, for example, to hold a prisoner in one of the facilities in Norway that's really revamped their approach is $93,000. The average cost of a supermax facility in America is $60,000 to $75,000. So you might say, well, that's a lot more expensive. Well, in Rhode Island, where I live, the annual cost of holding someone in high security prison for a year is $208,000. So there are vast differences across the country, and many places are far more expensive than we see in Scandinavia. The other critical difference, which you allude to, is that they have lower recidivism rates. So our detainees come back over and over and over again. Our recidivism rates are around 68% after 3 years. So we are paying that cost over and over and over again, whereas their recidivism rate has now dropped to 20%. So you're right, the cost is an upfront cost, but it's much lower over the long run. We're not great at this as Americans, right? With climate change and other things we don't like, upfront pandemic committees that needed funding before the pandemic. We're not great at proactive funding, but I think one of the things, again, looking at points of hope here, in a moment where there's almost zero bipartisan agreement, there is bipartisan consensus on the need for prison reform. And I think the economics drive a lot of that. I think that both sides of the aisle are looking at this issue and saying, this is not economically viable. We're paying a lot of money for something that's not working. And so we need to change it. And Cory Booker and Newt Gingrich were on the same stage of a conference arguing for the same things. I can't think of another political issue in our country right now where there's that kind of bipartisan consensus. So that gives me an enormous amount of hope. And I think that the fiscal piece is actually driving a great deal of that bipartisan support. I'd like to say it's the moral question, but I think it's actually a lot of people looking at the numbers and saying this is extraordinarily expensive and it's not yielding what we want it to yield. We're paying tons and tons of money and people just return over and over again. So I think the finances are huge. There's, of course, the whole other piece of private corporations, the privatization of prisons. And that, I think, is also a moral imperative for us to consider, that if there are corporations whose bottom line and whose stakeholders' interest depends upon more people being incarcerated for longer periods of time, that's a problem. And yet that's very much how the private prisons operate. And we need to decide as a country whether we agree that should be part of how we handle things.
Thank you for that. And so one of our questions is about, I guess, kind of your influence, and I'm just going to scroll down. Kim wants to know, have you been able to testify in front of legislatures to discuss sending people? It's a little hard to sort through. Anyway, have you been able to share this in front of legislatures, in front of Congress, in front of what? Have you been able to share this beyond your book, obviously?
So I have not. I have just recently heard from some groups that are putting forth legislation about ending solitary confinement, and I'm always open to hearing more. I think that it's important. There are all kinds of great voices in this conversation, and I'm happy to be one. It's been an interesting journey for me as a writer because the first book I wrote was a memoir. It was about the experience of dissecting a cadaver my first year in medical school. And it was this very kind of poetic memoir that had medical history in it and was about that experience. My second book was about like the 5 or 6 most compelling psychiatric patients that I encountered that sort of began to be an advocacy role. But this is really the first book, I think, that I've written that is really starkly a book that's arguing like, hey, this is wrong. And I can say from my position of expertise that I really believe this is wrong. So I haven't actually been in a role of advocacy much other than, I consider my clinical work advocacy on a one-to-one level, but I haven't been in a role of really arguing for things until this book. But I've learned enough now that I feel inspired to.
Well, I think you have a lot of people behind you who would like to join your team and see you do more. And since you brought it up, that I was curious about the solitary confinement issue. Can you talk a little bit about that? And Gordon, maybe you can chime in on this as well. It obviously is in the public discourse right now, so let's talk about it.
Yeah, Gordon, why don't you start? Because I've been talking. It'll give me a chance to take a sip of water, and then I'll piggyback on what you have to say.
Well, I can talk firsthand. I have lived experience in that area. I have spent up to 6 months in solitary confinement during my time in what's now called Osborne Correction. So I know the psychological damage that it does. Being housed in a place where there's just a small light running along the floor that stays on. That's the only thing you have, and you have no idea after some time what day it is, what time of day it is. You kind of gauge the time of day based on the mail that they slide through the slot in the door. It is very defeating. There's a lot of movement and there's a lot of advocacy now about removing solitary confinement from the prison systems in the state of Connecticut as well as throughout the country. I am totally in favor of that because the damage that it places on the individual is almost irreversible. They leave there totally scarred. That whole part of being institutionalized gets magnified when you spend a lot of time just totally separated from everybody with no human contact. And it's the only thing you hear is the self-talk in your head, which sometimes can get distorted after some time. So it's very damaging.
Absolutely. And you would know better than I, but what I researched backs up everything that you're saying. And so from my perspective, there's no question that that's true. And we've known it for hundreds of years now. So in the 19th century, there was a real drive. We invented solitary confinement in America. In Philadelphia, there was actually a Quaker group looking to reform prisons that developed a prison that the word penitentiary actually comes from. The idea was that people should go and be penitent in solitude and that this would help them reform. What they found instead is that people lost their minds. So people were held in these conditions of extreme solitary confinement, and they quite quickly deteriorated. We know this. There have even been Supreme Court cases where justices have written about the devastating effects of solitary confinement dating back to the 19th century. So we know that these are the effects that we are incurring when we put people in these conditions. The other thing that was fascinating for me, as a neuroscientist, was to look at what we know about the human brain when it's isolated in any situation. So when we have prisoners of war, or we have people who are shipwrecked, or we have people who are scientists in Antarctica who are isolated, the human brain in isolation responds in these very predictable ways. people become stuporous. They have changes in their EEGs, the brain, the electrical brain activity in their brain. They can start to hallucinate. They no longer trust their surroundings because they don't have reliable sensory information. They can have violent fantasies or injure themselves because they've lost any sense of sensory perception. And in desperation, you see a great deal of self-injury in patients who are in detainees who are in solitary confinement. And this is often ascribed to sociopathy, which is a code word for just like bad behavior, attention-seeking behavior. But as a psychiatrist, I understand that people only harm themselves when they're in extraordinary distress, and they either have no sense of themselves and grounded in the world, and they need some kind of pain to ground them, or they have no way of articulating their distress, and so they turn on that. And so when people have no way to feel heard, they resort to these more kind of primitive impulses. So yes, everything that Gordon says is not only true in the lived experience, as you described so eloquently, but also we know that on a neurologic level, on a psychological level, that we're damaging people when we confine them to solitary.
Wow. I'm just going to cut in here one more time, and then I'll go to some more audience questions. You know, this program is being recorded, as all of our crowdcasts are. I hope that people in the audience will share this conversation with other people, because just that last 5 minutes has been so important, and the whole conversation, obviously, but this is something more people need to be thinking about and hearing. So thank you for that. Tom wants to know, and I don't know if this is directed to you, Gordon, or to you, Christine, but will a book be made of your lived experience? Stories bring about social change, and we're talking about good guys and the bad. So can we talk about sharing stories? And maybe Gordon, tonight you're here with us. Is sharing your story part of a strategy for helping to address problems, or?
Well, sometimes it is a good tool for instilling hope in individuals that I work with. I try not to. It's developing a fine line, where so it's not about me. If I feel like I'm benefiting from this, then I need to be quiet about it. But if it's used correctly to instill hope, to let individuals know there is there's a way out of this. There's another side to this. Then it's totally beneficial and useful. And as far as stories, well, my oldest daughter always tells me, "Daddy, you need to write a book about some of your interesting parts of your life." Um, it being a good friend of mine, we've talked about this for some time now, um, and it might be of good use. It might be of help to some people, because there is what I find. A lot of people see me in a position I am, and I use a term. They see the now, but they don't see the how. What it took, what happened, the events, because I am a sum of my lived experience, good, bad, right, wrong, and indifferent. And it took all that to make the man that sits here today. So all that everything, all that builds who I am. Um, so sharing that does help. It was a cleansing part for me. But I'll take that under advisement about writing a book of those stories.
Well,
The power of human stories is so profound. You know, one of the things when I was writing this book was the data has been out there, right? But there are reports all the time about how ineffectual the prison system is, how inhumane it is. There are statistics after statistics and report after report. But I think part of my aim with this book, as with any book, is to share the human stories behind this. And when we look at social change in our country, you know, one of the foremost examples would be LGBT rights, that the rapid transformation of opinion from the idea that marriage was this traditional thing between a man and a woman toward marriage equality was really driven largely by people's stories, right? By people getting to know each other, sharing their stories, realizing that your neighbor, your son, your uncle, whoever, those stories had much more power to change. And so I think, Gordon, I'm in your corner for you writing a book. We can take this show on the road together. But I think there's great power in seeing that these practices affect human beings, and when human beings tell their stories, we're better able to understand. Better able to understand.
Beautifully put. Okay, so Gordon, we are committing you right now. When you do write this book, you have to come back here and share it with us. And Christine will be your moderator.
Right. I'll ask you the question.
That's the deal.
We've got a few more questions. Are you willing to stick around for a few more?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So I think this probably is for Christine, but both of you can chime in. Clearly, our criminal justice system is in need of reform. What are your top 5 recommendations for overhauling the current system so it is more humane, just, compassionate, and restorative rather than strictly punitive? Thanks for that good question, Mary.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So I don't know about top 5 and meeting all of those goals, but the things that really drive me in terms of the things I think we need to change. I think we have to vote people into office who are not running on tough on crime promises. I think that's a trick to make us feel afraid, and it actually incarcerates too many people for too long. I think one of the things, again, I'm putting on my doctor hat just because that's the hat I have. But I think one of the things that was so interesting to me, when you come from one system and go into another system, you sometimes see things differently than the people who are in that system. And I'm sure that would be true if people who work in corrections came into the hospital. But one of the things that I was aware of is that as a doctor, in medicine, we assess risk all the time. That we assess risk and we make decisions based on that risk. And we acknowledge that we cannot possibly rule out every modicum of risk in any situation. So every time I discharge a patient from the hospital, that's uncomfortable. I know that they would be safer if I held them in the hospital forever, especially my patients who have thoughts of hurting themselves or other people. That's incredibly uncomfortable. And yet, it's not realistic to hold them in my hospital forever. And so I have to rely on my expertise and the training that I've received and the data that I know is out there and the individual. And I do an assessment and I talk to trusted people and I discharge patients from the hospital. And every now and again, there's a disastrous outcome for that. And the quote that I stand by all the time is that there are 2 kinds of psychiatrists, those who have had patients kill themselves and those who will have patients kill themselves. So there's risk in what we do, and that's devastating. It's not unique to psychiatry. The example I write about in my book is mammography. We could do mammograms on women starting at the age of 15 or 20. As soon as women have breasts, we could start doing mammography. We know that some very young women get breast cancer and die from it. And yet, when we look at the whole curve, we say we should advise people to begin getting mammograms at age 40. We understand that there are going to be some tragic outcomes before that time, but it just doesn't make sense to put women through that, to put the resources toward that. And so there are these kinds of risk assessments that are done in medicine all the time. In prison, I think our approach is to lock up more people for as long as possible to try to reduce any possibility of risk. And what we do when we do that is we incarcerate too many people for too long. So I think there's a real argument that people who don't pose a risk to society ought not be incarcerated. And if they are, they ought not be incarcerated for prolonged periods of time. So, people ask me if I'm a prison abolitionist, and I say no, that I believe that there are people who cannot safely remain in our community. But the number of those people is a tiny, tiny fraction of the number of people that we currently incarcerate. So I think that's not the top 5. But one of the main things that I would take bringing my doctor's eye is to really assess, does this person pose a risk? If they do, how real is the risk? How persistent is that risk? And let's keep checking. Let's not sentence them to 80 years and never look again. Let's look and see who they are after 5. Let's look and see who they are after 10. I mean, as Gordon says, not just the now, but the how, right? And that how didn't happen overnight. You don't go from being someone who can commit a terrible crime one day to someone who, who does not the next day. But there's a transformation, and we have to make room for that.
Mm-hmm.
That was an amazing answer. Thank you. Looks like some more people have chimed in with questions since we got started. So this is from my colleague and friend Jacques, who I think both of you know. He says I'd like to hear how Gordon and other CPA employees work with recently released individuals to get the mental health support services they need. Thank you, Jacques. That's a great question.
Well, the program I've worked with within CPA is the SAMHSA program. And one of the main criteria, 2 pieces of criteria, is they have to have and/or substance abuse and mental health history. One by themselves or both. And the other piece is they have to be willing to engage in some form of treatment to address those. That's standard to begin with. And then after they agree to it, then I work with them in the sense that I help them navigate the path. I don't tell them where they have to go, but I allow them to pick whatever's, because 9 times out of 10, if an individual that's been incarcerated, based on the number, their inmate number will tell me how many times they've been incarcerated. And so that will tell me that if they have long-term substance abuse or mental health, they've been to some form of treatment. So they're familiar, they have a history. So I allow them to go to a place that's more familiar, they're more comfortable with. And then I encourage them to keep going and to address those issues, because not to reoffend, they have to address those underlying issues. It's not about the crime they committed. It's about those things that led to that. There's an underlining, we have to go beneath the surfaces, which I try to touch on with them so they can address those issues before they reoffend, because the reoffending is like the iceberg theory. That's only 10% of the problem. That's the visible part. The visible behavior is the committing of the crime. The part we don't see is the mental health, the low self-esteem, the abandonment, all the other things that lying sometimes dormant underneath. And we don't get to that unless we have a conversation, an honest conversation, asking them, okay, tell me about your childhood. Tell me about high school. Tell me about this. And based on those conversations, we can decipher, okay, maybe we get like a map of what took place and maybe what led them. Like we keep bringing up the how. What led them? What's their how that gets them to the now? That person sitting in front of me with the criminal record, the mental health background, with the mental health as well as the substance abuse.
Well, thank you for your work and all you do and all that Community Partners in Action does for our community. We are grateful to you for that. And we're grateful to you personally, Gordon, because you were called in to do this job at the last minute, so to speak. And you've done just an amazing job as moderator. Christine, I was just texting somebody checked in with me saying you're just so great at expressing these ideas in ways that we can all relate to and share. And so thank you for illuminating these issues and bringing them to the light. And I just feel like my head is spinning. I can't wait to. So I'm going to ask each of you, and this is a question that came from the audience as well. What can we do as citizens? As concerned citizens, people of the world, what can we do to make things better?
So the wonderful news here is that there's so many potential opportunities for involvement. So absolutely, there are political means of getting involved. As I said, making sure that the candidates you support common sense, justice legislation and justice reform. There are ways to make personal contact with people who are incarcerated and try to make the experience of incarceration more tolerable. There are ways to get involved helping bring kids to visit their parents, or reading, facilitating ways for detainees to read books to their kids so that the kids can listen to recorded voices. You know, the list goes on and on and on. But I think also really maintaining an awareness of the fact that this system is not one that you should just think about tonight and then not think about again, but really recognize that this is a work in progress in our country. You know, the great Brian Stevenson, who I think is just one of the moral leaders of our time, talks about getting proximate, you know, getting close to the people who are in the system and getting close to the issues within the system. So I think for those of us who live free lives while our fellow citizens live in cages, the onus is on us to understand what we're doing to help put them there. So I think that we read books, we enact policy, we donate our money and our time, and we keep working.
That's brilliant. Gordon?
I would say there's a lot of things we could do on the political front, as Christine said, but my biggest thing is more personal, learning to see people, like see them, not get past the surface, get past what we were taught to recognize or identify as or make a connection as when we see the individual. When we see a person or we hear they committed a crime, stop seeing their crime. Stop seeing what's on paper and see them. They're a person. They made bad choices. Their whole essence should not be based on one choice or a few choices. We're more complex than just a handful of choices. There are many more facets of who we are, and we need to start seeing people. When we look at someone, see them. And if we start seeing them, we'll start treating them as human beings, fellow human beings. And maybe if we start doing that on an individual level, it will catch on. And maybe we'll lessen the discrimination, the hatred, and all that holds us against and keeps us separated from one another.
I love that idea that none of us wants to be defined by the worst thing we've ever done, right? And so seeing that all of us have shameful things in our past, all of us have the capacity to commit problematic acts, and seeing beyond that shared humanity.
And you know who would be chiming in on this is Mark Twain. He would have agreed completely and really loved this conversation and loved what you've concluded with. And I think you've done him proud tonight. So thank you very much. And thank you for joining the Mark Twain House family. We hope to see you again and give you both a tour of the house if you ever are able to get here to do that. Gordon, would you do me the favor of holding up Christine's book again, please? And I'll remind people that if you were not compelled to buy this book before, I cannot imagine that you're not compelled to buy it now. So please click that link and do what you can to support us and Community Partners in Action. And Christine, Gordon, thank you. This has just been one of the memorable evenings of my career, and I thank you so much. So don't be strangers, and thank you to our audience for your participation and great questions.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you, Gordon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was truly an honor.
No, honor is all ours. Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.